Welcome to the Flipped Classroom on the evolution of Christian society in Western Europe, or medieval Europe. Your book covers medieval Europe in chapter 16, chapter 19, and chapter 21. So this PowerPoint is going to put all of those together and focus on really broad themes that are reflected in the key concepts. So what you need to know from these chapters for the AP test. Now, the book obviously goes into much more detail. We've got 3 chapters here. And if you are a European historian and this is something you really enjoy, please read those chapters for a more selective and specific view of what's going on here. But I'm going to try to connect the dots for you. The picture here is of St. Mark's Basilica. This is in Venice. And while today we kind of think of Venice as a tourist destination, sinking and beautiful, you got to go there once in your life, that kind of stuff. At this time period, Venice was a powerhouse in medieval Europe, and we'll look at what that meant and why they were such a powerhouse soon. But remember this image, St. Mark's Basilica. So medieval Europe can be divided into 2 main time periods, the early period and the later period. There's a couple differences between the two, and I'm going to try to highlight them here. So early on, so let's say before 800 or so, there's a lot of invasions, and invasions continue even after 800. These invasions keep things really decentralized. And this decentralization is an after effect of the fall of the Roman Empire. And there's no centralized political order, but there is political order in what we're going to call feudalism. As time goes on and invasions lessen and the earth warms up a little bit, agricultural productivity increases, and that leads to more trade and a stronger economy in Europe. But Europe remains pretty isolated during this time period. Unlike the rest of the world, they're not experiencing this huge growth in trade. The church becomes a central piece of medieval life, as you're going to see, and that it both harkens back to the Roman Empire, it is a source of leadership, it's a source of wealth, and it's a source of cultural unity. Now, later on in medieval Europe, things start to stabilize and Europe becomes a more powerful economic and cultural force. You even start to see Europe step outside of itself and start to influence cultures around the world violently with the Crusades. And the Crusades weren't just in the Middle East, they extended in other areas. They were basically an attempt to make people convert Christians and to take back Christian lands, or what they saw as Christian lands. During the later part of the medieval period, regional states that we kind of think of as European, like France and England and Spain, start to become more solidified. There's even more trade and a focus on cities. And Europe, because they start to go more outside of themselves, they rediscover philosophies and philosophers like Aristotle, and that their contact with these other groups help them to expand technology. And thus, religion, technology, and disease, such as the bubonic plague, had really big effects in Europe. So to begin with, we're going to go to the early side of things. We're going to follow Europe politically through this time period, starting with invasions. There were 3 main groups of invaders. There were the Muslims. I don't have a specific map for the Muslims, so I'm just going to show you here. They came up, well, there's actually a piece of land here, right? Straits of Gibraltar and all that. So the Muslims, or as the Europeans called them, the Moors, came up through Spain, and they were stopped about right there by Charles Martel and his fierce Carolingian army, or Charles as he's known, the Hammer, because of his stopping of the Muslims. But the Muslims then hung out like in Spain, basically. The Magyars were a more nomadic group coming from from this region here. And they, as you can see, were very prolific in their invading, especially in the 900s. All those orange lines are places they went. And then, of course, Minnesota. We have the Vikings, right? This map describes the territories and voyages / destruction of the Vikings. The Vikings were a very special group of invaders because they had new technology in their shallow bottom boats. Now, what's so good about a Viking boat? Well, the great thing about a Viking boat is that it can be used both at sea and in rivers. So, as you can tell from this map, the Vikings could go all kinds of places and invade all kinds of places like Paris that no one had ever been able to invade before. So, all of these inland cities that had thought themselves to be safe were not safe from the Vikings. And the Vikings were very fierce attackers. It's where we get the word berserk from. So they would go berserk, right? Their attacks were the people in their, what am I trying? They're soldiers. They're raiders. They were called berserkers, right? Because they would go, well, that's where we get the word berserk from. They would go berserk, right? They would go crazy. It was a huge slaughter. And they usually planned their invasions around Christian festivals so that they knew that a bunch of wealth was going to be in the city. Eventually, the Vikings set up some permanent settlements. In fact, you can see this settlement set up in Normandy. The Normans eventually invade England. So you can also see in Scandinavia this huge influence in Iceland, et cetera, et cetera. You can see that from the map. So the bright green stuff. Here is a picture of the longships. This one's actual Viking ship, and it's in Norway. You can also see a replica of a Viking ship in Moorhead. No, I think it's Moorhead, Minnesota. But yeah. Okay. So in the next part of this PowerPoint, we're going to be going over the decentralized organization of medieval Europe.